US-Russia peace plan talks. What do we know so far? We will talk about this with David Tafuri, international lawyer and former US State Department official. Mr. Tafuri, it's a pleasure to welcome you and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me again.
David, US Secretary of the Army Daniel Driscoll met with the Russian delegation in Abu Dhabi to discuss the peace process, according to CBS News and the Financial Times. According to CBS News sources, Driscoll met with the Russian delegation in the Abu Dhabi on the evening of Monday. The meeting lasted several hours. What might this unusual diplomatic channel suggest about the current phase of the peace process? Why do you think Abu Dhabi was chosen as the venue for such talks?
Well, we know that there was a 28-point peace plan put forward by the U.S. that was apparently drafted in close coordination with Russia. And many of those points would likely be unacceptable to President Zelensky and to the government of Ukraine. And so it's hopeful for us to look at that as more of a starting point rather than anything close to what would be a fair ending point. So now there are discussions between the U.S. and Ukraine, and it sounds from media reports like the government of Ukraine and President Zelensky have made progress in convincing the U.S. to amend the plan. One report suggests that it's been reduced from 28 points to 19 points. Probably that means that some of the points that were unacceptable to Ukraine have now been removed from the plan. And Abu Dhabi is a natural place for a meeting like this. Middle East has been a place where mediation attempts have happened. Oftentimes they're in Doha, but the United Arab Emirates would also like to be involved in helping mediate disputes like this in order to assert its influence across the world.
David, the White House believes the negotiations to end the war in Ukraine were productive, but several differences remain. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt said, according to Sky News, Leavitt also said that a meeting between the US and Ukrainian presidents is not planned for this week. She added that the updated plan will need to be presented to the Russian side again. What kinds of issues do you think those remaining differences might relate to? Based on your understanding of the negotiation process, how might these unresolved differences influence the timeline or next steps in the peace process?
Well, as far as we know, the Kremlin and Putin have not changed what they are demanding for a ceasefire and for a peace agreement since the very beginning of the illegal invasion of Ukraine. And so any changes to the 28-point plan, which was essentially the plan that Russia has been demanding for years now, would likely be unacceptable to Russia. That would likely include the restriction on Ukrainian military and the size of the Ukrainian army. Hopefully that has been changed because that's pretty unreasonable toward Ukraine. But Russia wants a limitation like that. There was also a point in the 28-point plan that said that European troops could not be in Ukraine, whereas the European countries have talked about having troops in Ukraine after a peace agreement as an important part of ensuring that Russia complies with the agreement. Then, of course, another area where there is disagreement between Ukraine and Russia, and that's probably playing out in these negotiations, is over what happens with territory. Russia is insisting they want all of Donetsk province, but they don't even control all of Donetsk province. So Ukraine has a really strong argument that they should not have to cede territory, which they currently occupy and have been able to defend.
David, according to sources from the Wall Street Journal, the first draft of the plan was initiated by envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner during their return flight from the Middle East, riding the wave of success following the agreement between Israel and Hamas. And they worked on the document for a month. While Steve Witkoff's involvement is well known, could you explain who Jared Kushner is and what role he has played in these negotiations?
Well, Jared Kushner is President Trump's son-in-law. He's married to Ivanka Trump, President Trump's daughter. And he had a prominent position in the first Trump administration in the White House, especially focused on foreign policy issues and in particular on the Middle East. He made strong contacts in the Middle East, which could be another reason why these talks are happening in the United Arab Emirates. And he has played as an envoy for President Trump, someone who has President Trump's ear and someone who understands how President Trump likes to negotiate. But that doesn't necessarily mean that taking an approach that's at all similar to what was achieved with Gaza is going to work for Ukraine. These are very different crises with a very different background and history.
David, Yuri Ushakov, an aide to Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, has said that Russia finds many points in the US 28-point peace plan acceptable, but that Europe's alternative plan absolutely does not suit Moscow. Russia will continue to refuse and drag out time, rejecting various proposals. In your view, how might the US under Trump's leadership exert pressure on Russia to move toward a settlement? What actions could the European Union realistically take to impact Russia's behavior in the negotiations?
There continue to be two main ways to put pressure on Russia. And the more President Trump and our European allies utilize them, the more likely we are to actually get a reasonable proposal from the Russians. Those two ways are, one, continuing to provide military support to Ukraine, advanced weapon systems, including some of the systems that Ukraine has requested, like Tomahawk missiles and continued supply of Patriot missiles and other sophisticated weapons. Second is economic impact on Russia, especially sanctions, or also what President Trump calls secondary tariffs. These are intended to hurt Russia's economy, make it harder for Russia to continue to buy weapons and to pay its army so it can prolong the illegal invasion of Ukraine. If those two areas are continued to be focused upon and we continue to ratchet up on both, providing more weapons, more support, more training to Ukraine, and more economic sanctions and economic initiatives against Russia that hurt Russia's economy, especially targeting its oil sector, that's the way to put the right amount of pressure on Russia so that Russia will make concessions. Until now, those have worked some, but not enough.
David, not enough, and yes, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent noted that EU countries are actually lagging behind when it comes to exerting economic pressure on Russia. Treasury Secretary Bessent sharply criticized Europe's approach to sanctions against Russia, calling the efforts ineffective while praising President Trump's decisive actions. So what about EU countries?
Well, I would like to hear the reply from the EU and the European countries. They obviously have sanctions that are very similar to what the U.S. has put in place. In fact, oftentimes the U.S. and Europe are lockstep announcing sanctions that are similar or the same around the same time. But sanctions is more than just putting out there the restrictions. It's also enforcing the sanctions. And so perhaps Secretary Bessent is suggesting that Europe hasn't done a good enough job of enforcing its sanctions. If that's accurate, then Europe needs to do that. And I would like to hear what the European response is. One other area of disagreement is that European countries continue to buy oil and gas from Russia, although that's a very limited number of countries, mainly Hungary and Slovakia. And Hungary has been a difficult country to deal with on Ukraine. It's actually more in line with the U.S. than it is with Europe, and there's that close friendship between Orban and President Trump. So if the U.S. administration is truly upset about the buying of Russian oil by Hungary, President Trump could lean on President Orban in order to get Hungary to stop buying Russian gas and oil.
David, concerning the role of President Trump, yes, President Donald Trump has not been involved in the details of the 28-point peace plan drafted by his administration as part of efforts to address Russia's war against Ukraine, reported by the Washington Post. And according to the Washington Post, an unnamed U.S. official described Trump's level of awareness as minimal. Quote, you tell him, I'm going to try to get a deal. He will say, great, go see what you can do. And that's the level of detail he has. What might this indicate about decision-making and delegation within the current U.S. administration? And what do you think about this publication?
Well, presidents do have to delegate power, but with something as important as this, you would think President Trump would be strongly familiar with what his team is doing. And it would not be wise for President Trump to just let Witkoff do this on his own. Neither President Trump nor Witkoff have a strong background and familiarity with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, so they should be relying on experts and on intelligence reports from our intelligence agencies and from our diplomats in order to inform the approach that they take to try to get a peace agreement. It's a good thing for the U.S. to press for a peace agreement. And if you want to be charitable, you could say this 28-point plan was just a starting point. But the deal it envisions is not fair or reasonable for Ukraine. And so it's very important that President Trump and his diplomats and envoys like Witkoff are listening to the Ukrainians, matching what the Ukrainians are telling them with the intelligence reports they're getting from intelligence agencies and from diplomats, and then acting upon that to amend the 28-point plan in a manner that's fair to Ukraine and still hopefully acceptable to Russia.
David, you mentioned that to influence Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, pressure must come in the form of military support. In Washington, officials stated that arms supplies to Ukraine are limited and cannot continue indefinitely, emphasizing the desire to end the war, according to an interview Karoline Leavitt gave to Fox News. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt said that the U.S. Cannot provide Ukraine with weapons indefinitely amid the ongoing war with Russia. According to Leavitt, the U.S. president has invested a tremendous amount of time and energy in seeking ways to resolve the conflict, as she said, and deserves recognition for his efforts. In her view, the primary goal is to stop the killings and bring the war to an end. How do you interpret the statement that U.S. arms supplies to Ukraine are limited and cannot continue indefinitely?
Well, that is consistent with what the Trump administration has said from the beginning when President Trump took the oath of office in January. And it's also consistent with the campaign that they weren't going to continue, at least at the level that the Biden administration was, in terms of donating weapons, giving weapons for free to Ukraine. U.S. weapons still can't be provided to Ukraine. The model that has developed is that Ukraine is using its own funds and also funds that are provided by Europe to buy U.S. weapons. And that should be in the interest of President Trump. He talks about wanting American companies to have more deals, to have more manufacturing here in the United States, to correct the trade imbalance that we have with countries around the world. And so one way to do that is for us to sell U.S. weapons to Ukraine. So hopefully that can continue. And obviously, the American defense industry is almost unlimited in its capacity and capability to build more weapons and construct more weapons. They just have to get the orders in, and it will take some leadership by the Trump administration to steer our defense companies to starting production lines that will be important for the future of Ukraine. Also, it's important that Ukraine has the funds to buy these weapons, and one way that Ukraine could get these funds is to use the frozen Russian central bank assets, which has been discussed a lot.
David, and NATO allies should make regular contributions, for example, to the Pearl program at a level of approximately $1 billion per month so that Ukraine can receive U.S. weapons without interruption. What challenges could arise if NATO contributions to the Pearl program are delayed or insufficient?
Well, it would be very problematic. It's really important that the funding streams continue for Ukraine. The need on the battlefield is great and significant, and Ukraine can only match the firepower of Russia with the assistance of Europe.
David, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan held a telephone conversation with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. They discussed ending the war in Ukraine. According to the Turkish President's office and the Kremlin press service, what role might Turkey be playing as a mediator or facilitator in the peace process? How could such high-level communication influence the broader dynamics of negotiations involving Ukraine, Russia, and Western partners?
Well, Turkey is one of the few countries that's managed to maintain relations with both Ukraine and Russia and to sort of be in between on this war, although it's provided a good amount of support to Ukraine. And so President Erdogan, in that way, maintains some influence with both sides. And so he is a natural choice to be a mediator. I think it's important for Turkey to see this conflict end, but Turkey also understands that it doesn't want Russia to completely prevail and take over a sovereign country. That would be a threat to Turkey and her historical antagonisms between Turkey and Russia that should make President Erdogan very skeptical of President Putin and his intentions.
And also, yes, President Donald Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping held a phone call during which they discussed Russia's war against Ukraine. According to the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Xi Jinping told Trump that since their meeting in South Korea, relations between the United States and China have maintained a stable and positive trajectory. He urged the American leader to keep up the momentum, keep moving forward in the right direction on the basis of equality, respect, and mutual benefit, lengthen the list of cooperation and shorten the list of problems so as to make more positive progress. How might discussions about Ukraine fit into the broader agenda of US-China diplomatic and strategic priorities?
This is an ongoing story. The relationship between President Xi and President Trump and China and the U.S. has its ups and downs. Perhaps, as President Xi said, it's now in an up period, so a more positive period where tensions have eased a little bit. If that's correct, you would hope that the Trump administration would use this moment to put pressure on China not to provide support for Russia, to be a productive contributor to the negotiations over a long-term peace agreement. Russia is pretty isolated still. It doesn't have a lot of allies. It really depends on China for trade and for getting component parts that are essential to its war machine. So any incremental changes in China's approach to Russia, or if China were also to put pressure on Russia for a peace agreement, that would be very helpful. And that's something President Trump and the Trump administration should be trying to help achieve with its negotiations with China.
David, and also we need to say that on the night of November 25th, during the massive attack on Ukraine, Russia launched over 460 drones and 22 missiles of various types. President Volodymyr Zelensky reported some of these drones entered the territory of neighboring countries. During Russia's overnight attack on Ukraine, one of the drones entered Moldova's airspace and crashed into a house. And it is noted that a bomb disposal and police technical team was sent to the scene. People from nearby houses were evacuated and the area was cordoned off by police. What message does this send about the broader risk of escalation beyond Ukrainians' borders? How might international partners respond diplomatically or through security measures to such incidents?
Well, first of all, this is grotesque that Russia is claiming it's in advanced negotiations over a peace agreement, and yet it's stepping up its attacks on civilians. And the attacks last night in Kyiv were tragic and civilians were killed, which is unfortunate. And also, as you mentioned, we are also seeing some spillover into neighboring countries, which is a reminder that Russia's intentions may not just be limited to Ukraine. Its territorial expansion and its thirst to recreate the Soviet empire seems unending. And so it's been a threat to the Baltic states, it's been a threat to Poland, it's been a threat to Moldova, and we see that in the incursions that just happened. And NATO needs to respond in kind. Remember, there's the Article 5 obligation of all NATO countries to defend all NATO countries. And so anytime a NATO country like Poland experiences an incursion into its territory, there should be a very strong and forceful response from NATO.
Mr. Tafuri, thank you so much for this important and interesting conversation. Thanks for supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian people. David Tafuri, international lawyer and former US State Department official, was with us today. Please share this interview and continue supporting Ukraine. David, thank you so much and see you.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.